So this course is about scientific publishing, and I will be speaking how to prepare your manuscript to a version that then will be published in a scientific publication. I'll start discussing about scientific publishing, about its history and the present practices, and then I'll follow with discussion how to prepare a manuscript to a publication, then something about different types of publications in science, and after that something about contracts and agreements, and finally something about open access and parallel publishing, which is a very hot topic at the present. So the history of scientific publishing is actually quite young. You can see a picture of the first scientific journal there that was printed about 350 years ago. So the present type of publishing articles, publishing scientific documents, has a history about a couple of hundreds of years. And then the digital environment is actually very young even compared to this one. So we can speak about a couple of decades of digital publishing of scientific documents. But publicity is very important for the science because it's one of the basic principles and even core values in science. So you can even say that only that research that are open publicly, that is published and given to criticism by other scientists, that can be said that that's the science that we are discussing about when we speak about science. And then one thing that one has to bear in mind when discussing about publishing is that structures of the scientific publishing, they have this long history. You have the structure of, for example, scientific article or scientific monograph that has a history of a couple of hundreds of years. And now when we are entering the digital realm, this digital realm also starts to have its own rules and guidelines how to publish, how to make the manuscript as a publication. So one has to learn these things, and one has to bear in mind that these rules are also made in order to help the publishing and help the readers to read the publications. So it's very easy for us to read a scientific paper or scientific monographs. We know what the references are, we know where the title and preface and things like that are. One thing that's very important for scientific publishing is that it takes time. Even at the present time, when you can publish immediately everything that you write in the internet, the scientific publishing takes time. Normally, when you publish an article in scientific journal, it takes from half a year, even up to 2 years when the final version is published. And that is because of the reference and editing process that takes time, and that is done in order to assure the readers that the contents of the scientific publications are relevant and are up to date, and you can trust on the results that are published in them. So that differs the scientific publishing very much from the everyday publishing, where you can, as was mentioned, publish whatever you want and say whatever you want in public. In science, you can state a fact, but only after other scientists have reviewed and criticized your propositions. After that, your work becomes part of the science. And then, of course, in scientific publishing, there are even longer timelines. For example, when one writes textbooks or reference works, it may take even years from the table of the researcher when it's given to the public. Usually, especially the students mean the primary research articles and maybe monographs, books, when they speak about scientific literature. But one has to bear in mind that there are very many types or genres of scientific literature. Here is a list of the major ones, but even other ones exist. And it is very important for the researcher to know these different types of documents and how to write them, because every type of publication has its own role when you are acting as a researcher, especially if you have a longer career or if you are acting in a leading positions. So in addition to the research articles and scientific monograph, we have review articles, editorials, where you can say and tell about your opinions. Then we have trade publication articles, which we try to tell about science to a bigger public. Then of course we have quite a lot of news, blog posts, article comments, and these types of discussion documents. And then there's quite a lot of reporting and grey literature things going on, especially when you are working in a laboratory environment. And then of course, depending on the subject that you are researching or studying, we have maps, different types of conference proceedings, books, book series, and then of course dissertations and other types of theses. These all have their own rules and regulations how to prepare a manuscript to an article, to a publication, or to a book. So it's very important to know how you make your manuscript so that it can be published as some kind of type of scientific literature. But I'll be back to that in a moment. So here's a picture of the publishing process. It starts with manuscript, but of course there's quite a lot of scientific work behind that. You need to collect data and analyze it and discuss it with people, especially if you are working in a research group. And then you prepare your manuscript either by yourself or in a group, and then you offer it to the publisher to be published, and the publisher may make even quite fast decision to reject the manuscript or then accept it to the review. And then starts the review process, and it takes normally a couple of months, but I have a experience even of review processes that have taken for 1 year. So it depends on journal and even about the paper manuscript type that you are trying to get published. And after the review, the editing of the manuscript starts, and usually it takes again 1 month or couple of months, and even especially if a new review is needed, it takes time. So this is also one reason why the publishing of the scientific papers, scientific monographs, they really take this about half a year, from half a year to 1 year to be published. And this is the preparation process, and then you get the acceptance to be published, and after that you do legal issues, you do agreements with the publisher, and then you get proof of your paper, and it's very important to read the proof if there's any mistakes, especially in figures or numbers or data analysis. And then you get your paper or book published. And as was mentioned earlier, the process of scientific publishing doesn't stop when the publication is being published, but after that the other readers, the other academics read it and they can make remarks or public criticism. So it's very important to follow this discussion and take part in it, especially if there are arguments against your paper. So when you're starting to publish your manuscript or think where you should publish it, the first thing is to find a forum that is a publication, whether it is a journal or book publisher or whatever. And there are several things even at this phase to be thought of. First of all, do you want a high impact or high level of readers, or do you want both? Do you want to be published very fast, or do you want to wait for publication? And especially if you are wanting to be published in so-called precious journals, the competition is very hard. It might be even that less than 10% of the manuscripts that are sent to a high-level journal are being published. So at that level, it's not only the contents that are important, but even you have to be in due time or even have luck to be published. And after you have found your forum, the first thing is to go to the journals or publishers' web pages and check what kind of guidelines and tools there are for you to make your manuscript as good and as relevant to the journal to be published. This is very important part because this is one of the reasons why the manuscripts are rejected, and these are actually very easy things to accomplish. And it's very important to utilize also reference management tools because it helps in finalizing your journal and your paper, and especially if you are going from one journal to another, it's easier to manage the references if you are using these reference management tools. And then you send it to the journal to be evaluated, and as was mentioned, you usually get some feedback of corrections to be made, and then you sign the copyright and you get published. And it's very important also to promote and market your publication, especially using the web tools like LinkedIn or ResearchGate, or send emails to your friends, and if you have a web page for your group, for your research group, to try to publish and promote your publications via those channels. At the present, most of the manuscripts are sent to a journal or publisher via editorial systems. These are found from the web pages of the journal, and you usually have to make account to them, and then you log in and you start uploading your data and your files to a system according to its rules and regulations. And it's very important again to read the guides. If the journal says that you have to send your file in a certain time or type or edit it according to some rules, you have to do, otherwise you won't be accepted to the referee process. And editorial systems are also very good for the academics and writers, because they archive the history of the whole process, including the reviewing. So you can go and check whether your paper is under review or whether the review has ended. And personally, I have the practice that if nothing is happening within a couple of months, then I'll send a letter to the editor and ask what is happening with my manuscript. And then when you start publishing your paper or book, you have to write publishing agreement. This is agreement that gives right to make copies, so-called copyright, to a publisher. So after this agreement, the publisher can make the copies and sell or disseminate them in their own systems as has been agreed in this agreement. And it's very important, especially if you publish in non-academic publishers, to at least return the academic rights to the contents and rights to parallel publish and distribute your paper or your files to your colleagues. So the first thing means that the publisher can't make alterations to the contents, and this is of course very important in science. If the publisher makes, for example, editing to the results or the data, you can imagine what will happen to the paper or book after it has been published. And now when we are speaking quite a lot about open access and opening our research, it's very important that you have right to give a version to the university's publishing archive and distribute your paper to your colleagues. And of course, depending on the case, you can also try to negotiate other rights to yourselves when needed. For example, if you're publishing books, you can even get money from publishing it, or you can get free copies for your use, and you can negotiate about the amount of it. And also you can negotiate about marketing of your book and papers. But there you have to discuss about your academic interests, and the publisher of course has their economic interest, and they might collide, and then you have to think about what's right for your publication and what you can agree with the publisher. The academic publishers usually do very standard version of these publishing agreements, but as I mentioned, if you publish with non-academic publishers, you have to be very careful with this agreement. So what's agreed on a publishing agreement? As was mentioned, first, what rights you give the publisher and what remains to yourself. And this is the first thing to consider about. And another thing is rights about the so-called third parties, which means that especially if you are using colleagues' pictures or any other part of their documents in your paper, you have to have a right to republish it. I usually send email to this type of colleagues and ask their permission, and then I have a written document about this issue. And then very important thing is when and in what form the manuscript is to be delivered to the publisher. Usually you have to do quite a lot of the editing and even finalizing the final editing of the manuscript, especially if you are writing monographs or books, and it takes time, and it may even cost for a researcher, for an academic. So it's very important to know what you agree. If you agree to pay to the publisher something, you really have to pay. Or if you get any recompenses, what are those? Are those money or other, as I mentioned, like free copies of your book? And then when and in what form the work is being published. Usually some of the publishers want to have as much rights as possible. So for example, they can publish another edition of your book without asking permission from you, and if it's not okay for you, then you have to negotiate it in this agreement. And again, very important issue, how long the agreement is valid and how it can be cancelled. So for example, this again in books, do you want to republish it, and after what time you can do it. And as I mentioned, it's very important to read the guides to the authors, and they are usually at the present found from the web pages of the publishers or from the web pages of the journal or any other publisher. And this, first of all, the guides tell what types of publications is being published in a journal or by that publisher. And this is very important thing, because it's no use of sending a manuscript that is not about the scope of the publication. They usually get rejected even if they are very good ones. And then how the manuscript is finalized and who pays the cost, what type of, for example, what type of files you have to send, how much do you have to do the final editing, do you have to check the language and things like that. And then how the manuscript is delivered and what kind of copyright agreements are to be made. And during the, I think, last 10 years, these ethical issues have become more and more important. So you have to tell the publisher, do you have any ethical issues that you have to publish, or have you had right to do the tests that you are conducting in your research. And then about the reviewing process and how it is conducted, and here it is very important if the journal tells you how long the reviewing process takes to check that something really happens during that reviewing process. And if not, as I mentioned, do send a nice letter to the editor and ask what's happening with your manuscript. And then about these copyright issues. And then if you get a rejection to your paper, here are the main reasons for rejection. And it's very important to notice that rejection does not always tell that your paper is bad one. You can get rejected even with a good paper. And the most important issue is here this out of scope. So do check that the journal really is publishing that type and that kind of manuscripts that you are trying to publish. But of course, if there's bad conduct or bad documentation of research, the papers are usually rejected totally, or a lot of editing is wanted by the reviewers. Then bad language or not according to the publisher's guides, so it's very important to also pay attention to the linguistic aspects, especially if you are non-native speaker with the language that you are trying to be published. And again, we are speaking about scientific publishing, so you have to have results and conclusions, and they have to be validated. If not, you usually get rejected, or they ask even new data gathering and data analysis. And of course, if the results are already known, or if you have too little data for a valid evidence, you get rejected. And if the journal wants to publish 20 pages, it's no use of sending 50 pages of manuscript to the publisher. You have to edit it. And if it's very fuzzy, if there's too much unfocused data, very much writing that doesn't focus on anything, you usually have to edit very heavily your paper. And when you are preparing your manuscript, check it with these bullets, because you can do most of these things in preparing your manuscript for the publishing, and when it's done beforehand, it again rises the probability that you get to be published. So you have to do the editing beforehand, not only after the reviewers have read your manuscript. And when the referees check your paper, they usually use this type of criteria. So first of all, the paper, the manuscript, have to have interest to the readers. So it has to have some new ideas, some new evidence, or give new points of view to the readers of the journal or the publisher. And it has to be written in a clear style, and it has to be readable. A normal educated person has to be able to understand it. And how the paper is organized, is it logical? Does it have enough evidence for the hypotheses that are made? Does it have enough references? So it has to have some novelty. And very important thing is also to write about the conduct of the researcher, so how it was planned, how it was done, so the reader really understands how the data was collected and how it was analyzed. Then it's very good to have tables and figures, because it usually tells that you have made some kind of analysis for the readers of your data and your hypothesis. And then it's very important to have up-to-date and enough coverage in your references. And the review result, very seldom, but it happens, is published as it is. Then you get very fast publishing. Usually minor or major editing is wanted. Minor editing is usually working with language or references or things like that. Major editing usually means that you have to reanalyze or even collect more data or do more analysis on the subject based on the papers that others have written before. And usually this leads to another review round, and it takes time. And then rejection. If possible, check from the publisher if you don't get the reason for the rejection, because it's very important to know why your paper did not meet the standards of the publisher. Because as I mentioned, the rejection may be because you only have sent your manuscript to a wrong type of journal. And then it's very important to do all the corrections that are needed, and then again write a short report what was done. For example, I usually write a minor report, and I edited the language, I did this further editing with the references, I did this type of data collection, because the editor and the reviewers really want to know what you have done with your paper in order to be published. And then there's a list of scientific misconduct or bad habits in science, and this is about contents. And it's very important to not to do this, because at the present most of the journals have systems that try to detect these type of problems. And again, the reviewers read your paper, and if you get caught from scientific misconduct, usually it's very bad for your reputation, or it can even ruin your career as an academic. So data manipulation or falsification is first of these. So you have to really collect your data and use, and even in some journals at the present publish it as it is. And you cannot leave out any unwanted data or results. So you have to tell to the readers, to the scientific community, what you really collected and what the data really tries to tell you. Methodological misconduct, for example, if you interpret partially or totally the research results, or if you use methods in a wrong way, or even if you don't understand what you are doing, this at the present is very easy with the computer systems, for example, statistical methods. And of course, plagiarism and copying is not permitted. You have to use references if you are using other people's research. Giving false author information, so you really have to do something about the paper, not just add names as authors. And falsification of your own CV information, so do not try to tell that you have done more than you actually have. And then in publishing, there's also some bad habits. First one is the most important: simultaneous publishing in several scientific forums. So never try to publish your manuscript at the same time in several forums. This will lead to a public shame, or even to a result that a good manuscript will not be published. So only send your manuscript to one journal, one publisher at a time, and if they reject it, then you can start another round. Salami slicing means that you try to make as much reports or publications as possible from your work. And ghostwriting, you write for another person, is of course a bad habit. Bailey in year 2000 said that you are an author in a paper, in a manuscript, if all of the following applies. So you have to design the project, you have to interpret the data collected, you have to be part of the writing team, you really have to do something about it, and then you have to approve the version to be published. So you have to be part of the whole process. And there's a good example of maybe ghostwriting. In the slide there's a paper, 45 pages, that has more than 5,000 authors. So if you consider this Bailey's author ideas, you really can ask, have all of these 5,000 persons been active in writing the paper? Of course, this depends quite a lot on the practices of the different subjects. These types of papers are usually made by a huge amount of people, but of course the final paper usually is written by a small group. Then some words about open access. During the last maybe 10 years, quite a lot has been discussed about this open access, and the idea here is that you try to open your scientific publishing to the largest possible audience. And for example, in internet, you open it to every person that are using the internet. This has two good results for the science. First of all, it serves the publicity of the science, it opens the biggest possible audience, and again, when you are publishing, especially in internet, very openly, it helps in fighting against bad habits and conduct of research. You can get more persons that can read and criticize your paper, and you can get automatic plagiarism recognition for these type of files. And at the present, the research policies and policymakers, research funders are requiring open access, and our university has its own policies where we try to open our research publications and even research data to as many readers as possible. At the present, there are different open access journals. First of all, there are these journals that are published only open access journal papers, and we have had even some book publishers that publish only openly. So these type of journals, they have all the articles in open use. Then we have hybrid model. For example, in some publishers you can pay extra money for your paper to be opened to the public. This is a bit not so good model, because actually when the university pays for the journals, and when you are also paying for the publishing of it, this is called double dipping, and of course it's not for the academic community. And then we have this parallel publishing, where usually university or some other organization gives you a possibility to publish your manuscript or your publication if the publisher gives you a right in a repository. And there's the link to our university's e-repository. And usually there are open access fees, so it's from $500 to $5,000 at the present. So usually you have to pay about 1,000 euros or dollars if you are trying to publish in open access. So it's very important when you are trying to get funding for your research to include these fees to your application. You can get more information of this open access from the university's web pages or from the library staff. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to send email to me.